You've heard the legends, the pioneers, the explorers, the empire builders. But what about the people underneath all of that? The ones who did the digging, the hauling, and the bleeding. The ones who made history happen and got nothing for it. These are the worst jobs in history, where we pull back the romantic myths and look at what it really took to build the world. Today, trappers. It was brutal, it was filthy, it was often deadly, and somebody had to do it. They would vanish into the woods for months, and they would come back rich or not at all. These men didn't just chase animals, they chased dreams. Dreams wrapped in the silky fur of beavers worth their weight in silver. Dreams of a life beyond poverty, beyond struggle. Dreams worth risking frostbite and plunging temperatures, worth gambling with starvation, worth facing wolves, bears, or worse. Every trapper knew someone who never returned. The man whose tracks disappeared beneath fresh snow. The cabin discovered empty, door swinging open, food untouched, as if its occupant had simply vanished into the wind. It was a trade where a single misstep, a broken leg miles from help, a storm catching you unprepared, meant death, swift and silent. But for those who emerged alive, hauling sleds piled high with pelts slicked with blood and ice, it was a chance at a life most men only dreamed about. For some, that dream came true. For others, the woods claimed everything. This was the brutal, lonely gamble of the fur trapper. So, who exactly were these men? These rugged souls who vanished into the wilderness chasing dreams wrapped in fur? Well, they came from all walks of life. French voyagers pushing westward from Quebec, British adventurers looking for fortune, indigenous hunters skilled enough to read the wilderness like a book, and restless Americans hungry for freedom from crowded eastern cities. Many were young, barely out of boyhood, poor, desperate, and willing to roll the dice with their lives for a shot at a better future. For some, trapping was less about riches and more about escape. Escape from debt, from authority, from the suffocating rules of civilization. But why beaver pelts? What made them so irresistible, so powerful that they could pull a man into frozen wilderness with death around every corner? Because somewhere in a London drawing room, a banker wanted a new hat. Somewhere in Paris, a nobleman wanted to look wealthier than the one beside him. The needs of the elite became the suffering of the poor. So these fur trappers, tough as the leather they wore, journeyed into lands uncharted by Europeans, motivated by visions of gold and fur form. Their hands calloused, their faces weathered, their spirits hardened by harsh conditions. These weren't gentlemen. They were risk-takers, outsiders, and survivors. Men who carved livelihoods from a merciless frontier. But while they suffered frostbite and hunger, the profits flowed upward. Fur companies, trading monopolies, and European elites grew richer with every pelt. They sat in counting houses and private clubs, drinking imported wine, while the men in the wilderness froze and starved. The wealth the trappers pulled from the land rarely stayed in their hands. Life on the trail wasn't living, it was surviving. Picture it clearly. Days upon days spent slogging through knee-deep snow or paddling endless waterways in leaky, patched-up canoes, your fingers permanently stiff from the cold. Everything you owned strapped to your back or crammed beneath a tarp, always damp, never dry. Meals were sparse, dry jerky, stale biscuits crawling with weevils, and whatever small animals you managed to trap along the way. Hunger gnawed constantly, a companion as persistent as the frostbite creeping into your toes. In winter, temperatures plunged so low your breath froze in your beard, and touching metal bare-handed was like grasping a blade. In summer, Swarms of mosquitoes blackened the air, buzzing relentlessly around your eyes and mouth, driving you to madness. Injuries were commonplace: sprains, broken bones, deep gashes from slipping knives. If you got sick, you were your own doctor, nurse, and priest. Fever or infection could finish you just as quickly as a bear's claws or an unexpected plunge through thin ice. The daily grind was relentless. Wake before dawn, muscles screaming from yesterday's labors, and immediately begin your rounds. Set traps, check traps, reset traps. Skin animals with numb fingers, blood congealing quickly on your sleeves and freezing into stiff, crusted reminders of your grim business. Pack up, move forward, repeat. Day after grinding day, month after exhausting month. There was no rest, no warmth, no safety net. Just you, the endless wilderness, and the bone-deep chill of isolation. Survival in the wilderness wasn't something the fur trappers managed alone. Truth be told, without the deep wisdom and skilled guidance of the indigenous peoples who'd called these lands home for generations, most trappers wouldn't have lasted their first winter. The indigenous nations understood the land, the shifting seasons, animal migration patterns, medicinal plants, and how to navigate terrain Europeans found baffling and deadly. Many fur trappers quickly recognized this expertise and forged vital alliances. They learned to speak indigenous languages, adopted survival techniques, and in many cases, married into local tribes, establishing lasting kinship networks and bonds of mutual support. But these relationships weren't always straightforward or peaceful. Some trappers saw the wilderness and its resources as theirs to exploit, stealing land, disregarding sacred grounds, and violently clashing over hunting territories. Trust was fragile, easily broken by betrayal or misunderstanding, turning allies into bitter rivals. Yet indigenous nations were far from passive observers. Skillfully playing rival European powers, the French against the British against the Americans, they leveraged trade and alliances to protect their communities, preserve their lands, and maintain political autonomy. They negotiated carefully, shrewdly weighing opportunities and risks to ensure their own people's survival and prosperity in the rapidly changing world. This was a complex dance, one filled with strategic cooperation, tense negotiation, occasional warmth, and frequent conflict. The story of the fur trade was, at its heart, the story of two worlds meeting, often violently, sometimes harmoniously, but always with profound and lasting consequences. Trading posts were more than just outposts in the wilderness. They were lifelines, sanctuaries, and battlegrounds all at once. Places like Fort Vancouver, Fort Detroit, and countless others scattered across the frontier represented brief, precious returns to civilization. After months alone in the brutal cold, trappers emerged from the wild, exhausted and desperate, their sleds piled high. The companies ran the posts and set the terms. No matter how hard a man worked, how many pelts he hauled in, the house always won. The powder was overpriced, the whiskey watered down, the goods marked up. At these forts, every beaver hide, every fox fur had its price, traded for gunpowder, blankets, flour, coffee, tobacco, or whiskey. The terms were harsh, tilted heavily towards the companies that controlled these isolated marketplaces. But trappers had little choice. The posts were their only connection to a world beyond endless trees and lonely rivers. The forts buzzed with tense energy, echoing with shouts in multiple languages: French, English, Ojibwe, Cree, all clamoring to be heard above the racket. Emotions ran high. Months of loneliness and deprivation could erupt into wild celebration, whiskey-fueled camaraderie, or sudden, deadly violence over insults, debts, or accusations of cheating. For a few fleeting days, the trading post was home, family, and civilization itself. But soon enough, the deals were done, pockets emptied or filled, and the trappers turned their backs once more, disappearing into the wilderness, their fate hanging in the balance yet again. The wilderness didn't just break bodies, it broke minds too. Imagine for a moment the silence. Not just quiet, but absolute, oppressive silence. Broken only by your own breathing, the distant crack of ice, or the occasional howl of a predator reminding you how alone you truly were. Trappers endured frostbite so severe fingers turned black and fell away, wounds that festered painfully for weeks, and gnawing hunger that twisted their insides. There was no medicine, no help, no comfort, just you alone, battling your body as it betrayed you. But it was the mental toll, the sheer, relentless isolation that shattered many. Letters and journals of the era speak hauntingly of men losing their grip on reality, recording desperate conversations with ghosts or companions who existed only in their imagination. Trappers described shadows that whispered to them, figures moving through the trees just beyond sight, voices carried on the wind, hallucinations brought on by months without human contact. "I talk aloud," one journal reads, "to remind myself I'm still here, but lately someone else has begun answering back." The wilderness was ruthless in its solitude, stripping men down until only their deepest fears and regrets remained. Some emerged from the woods forever changed, haunted, distant, unable to reconnect with civilization. Others didn't emerge at all, lost forever to the vast silence that had swallowed them whole. Nothing lasts forever, and the fur trade was no exception. By the mid-1800s, the very animal that had driven men into the wilderness began disappearing, hunted nearly to extinction. Beaver pelts, once so precious, started piling up unsold in trading posts. Back in Europe, fashion had moved on. Silk hats replaced beaver as the symbol of sophistication and wealth, collapsing demand overnight. The dream the trappers chased, the promise of fortune hidden in fur, vanished like a whisper on the wind. And as the demand vanished, so too did any sense of loyalty to the men who had made it all possible. Fur companies cashed out, investors moved on, but the trappers, they were left with broken bodies, empty hands, and no place in the new world they helped forge. At the same time, the West itself changed. Settlers streamed across the plains, pushing ever outward, bringing farms, towns, and factories. Railroads cut through lands once navigated only by canoe or on foot. Trappers, once vital adventurers and trailblazers, were now obsolete, forgotten relics of a fading era. Many sank into poverty, unable or unwilling to adapt to a world increasingly filled with fences and rules. Others simply disappeared, melting into the wilderness they once called home, their stories lost in the silence of the woods. Yet, the harshest consequences fell hardest upon indigenous communities. With trade relationships broken and territories flooded by settlers, displacement intensified, pushing entire nations from lands they'd stewarded for centuries. Alliances crumbled, promises were broken, and the delicate balance built over generations was shattered. The age of the fur trapper, the age of wild risk and rugged freedom, was over. What remained was memory, quiet and somber. Echoes of lives lived hard, dreams lost and found, and wilderness now forever changed. Today, the fur trapper lives on mostly in myth, romanticized as rugged mountain men, frontier heroes, and legendary adventurers in fringed buckskin jackets. Books, movies, and folklore gave us figures like Davy Crockett and Jeremiah Johnson, larger-than-life symbols of freedom, bravery, and self-reliance. But the real story is darker, dirtier, and far more complicated. The myth of the trapper often leaves out the math: who profited and who paid. For every fur that crossed the ocean and turned into a hat, there was a man who had nearly died to catch it, and he likely saw only a sliver of the wealth he generated. In truth, fur trappers weren't just rugged outdoorsmen. They were gritty survivors in a ruthless system. They navigated brutal realities: disease, starvation, loneliness, violence, and exploitation. The wilderness wasn't a romantic playground. It was a harsh proving ground, unforgiving and indifferent. And for every trapper who returned home wealthy or alive, many more vanished silently into the woods. However, even stripped of myth, there's still something undeniably compelling about these men. They weren't all good, sure. Few seldom are, participating in violent exploitation of animals and land alike, but they were also survivors, resilient beyond imagining. They lived by their own rules, facing challenges few of us could endure. In the end, the fur trapper's legacy is complex, tangled up in bravery and cruelty, freedom and tragedy. They embodied both the wild spirit of exploration and the brutal realities of a frontier world. And even as we peel away the myths, we're left in awe, because, at its core, their story remains an extraordinary testament to human endurance, and a stark reminder of how often the men who build the world are left behind by it. History loves to remember the men who wore the crowns, made the laws, and built the fortunes. But it forgets the ones who built the roads, dug the graves, laid the tracks, and risked everything for scraps. The story of labor is the story of the world, and most of the time, the people doing the work were the first to be forgotten. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll join us for more horrible jobs of history, where we remember the jobs that built the empire and the scars they left behind.